Coming this evening. I am so honored to be reading with my professor, Mary Jo. Thank you so much for supporting me throughout this whole book process and for being a genuine guide and help through this very unique and interesting landscape that is poetry publishing. I'm so glad to be reading with you tonight. Get my tongue. So, often from Black Pastoral, I read from a series of poems called Love Poem in the Black Field. And I'll just read the first one for now, but I thought I'd talk a bit about the origin of the series. Often we understand that the field is a place that holds a lot of horrible histories, especially for people of African descent, especially for Southerners, of which I am both. But we also must understand and contend with the idea of love in the field, because if it didn't exist, I wouldn't be here reading these poems tonight. So I'm going to share the first poem in the collection, Love Poem in the Black Field, Prologue. Somewheres, some lifetimes ago. I have run so far, so long. There is nowhere I haven't been but here, in this field. A body length from the ragged brink that gives way to forest. I collapsed here, the thin, hard slip of me whittled at both ends. I want badly to brave this aloneness now, as the hoofbeats swell like a whip welt around me, but I cannot. I weep for you. Clutch the hogweed, imagine it your wrist. Likewise, the stalks refuse to bend, even slightly, inside my balmy grasp. Oh, my saving grace, my heart's rest harrow, mere thought of you dams the plows that would have my head. When you arrive to pull me up from the mud, the salt will crumble from my eyes that for nights have seen nothing except that cardinal north from which the stars beckon, those stars that, like you, never fade from sight, even in the day blue sky. Then, for weeks, unspeaking, will follow their call, afraid to make more sound than does a mothling upon her first and final embrace with the open flame for which she confuses caged light. Such silence will we keep, that I'll believe it is the river who thanks me for our crossing, and not you, for waiting for me, we whisper, as if I have done you a kindness, as if my life is not one that began only when we met, as if I had not been dead and waiting for you before. Said the tobacco to the hand. Richmond, Virginia, 1705. Has your master ever made love without touching? Just dust, carried from legs to air to mouth on wings, almost too gossamer to lift your body. How do I feel to the touch? Your calluses like pestle, your palm mortar. You leave me, desperado, you, tender guillotine. My white tongues crumbled like sheets of two damp lovers who forsaken the bed they made for a looming dawn. How often do you dream of running yourself along a taut spine that never labored under a name not her own? What can you tell me about the ship, its hollow gut? What kind of dark it carries, the flesh sweet, a free-range sky or bitter entrails even the buzzards would let the heavens repossess. When spat up, tooth ground, onto cold foreign earth, is it best to put down feeble roots or to refuse to flower at all? Elders speak of the wind chimes. that quivered in the maples, the poplars, the hollowed pines, their copper shine in the gloaming, some notched with patterns as if by potter's curved blade, some filled to the mouth with birdseed and monkshood, as if to lure the crows and hornets and citrus marigolds. And so they came, pitched hued and thick as locusts. Some intoned a song that followed elders everywhere, on the smoked-out bus, in the vine-mangled lean-to past the corner store, resounding through the sundown valleys, through the tobacco leaves, a sour sound, like the ringing in your teeth after the first bite of an underripe nectarine. It became the score of their dreams, that chime song. Chimes made of blood-wet stone mountain clay and kiln-fired gullah mud. Chimes those icy gales withered to bone, chimes that sung all alone, without other chimes to strike, to crack their sorrow against, and louder still than the solo chimes were the chimes that had others alongside them, others with whom to lift that flickering dim heavenward, that soprano trill that could be heard over the midnight crickets, over even the thunderous Sunday organs, over the caterwauling sinnermen, over the rejoicing children of God. The dog's feeling it. Cruel ripening. To crush a summer thing into sweet gore, such field trip bliss and indulgent spoil of war were told to amputate any bad berries they find, to keep sickness from spreading through the patch. We're too young to respect what even the plants themselves have left for dead. We skip bulbs like bang snaps at each other's ankles, our ammo spangled with slimy seeds, with mold gray as permafrost. Laughing, we make magazines of plastic baskets loaded with produce, one sun from fermenting into moonshine. Red splashes off jeans, our souls repatriate the wrung-out mush to the dirt. When struck en masse, we fall into the waist-wide rows, like the ultraviolet embalm us into hot specimens. Aphids hover, unable to resist what, to them, is saprich and stiff. We, adolescent in this patch, begin to sense what sprouts sour around us. But we haven't yet grown beyond ignorance of what a scene such as this may bode. If there are any clouds overhead that day, I don't notice. But I do note the scored plot of my poem, its dark brown verso, in the sun turning darker, as it begs questions of this land, its history, my play upon it. This hand, made to pick in heat, made to find sugar in low places. We, more than the blunt-toothed leaves, are so very green. And I, alone in my own way, greener still. Our limbs windless. Crimson wounds flower like carnations on our chest. Magenta juice dyes our smiles. Our sweaty bodies betray the cruelty of ripening. What a sight we must be to passing traffic. What a sight I am to those watching from earlier fields. So erotic Black pastoral engages with the idea or questions, I suppose, of who made this earth. Is it God? Is it a grander spirit? Did the earth make itself? And also, who owns it? Who owns the people? Who owns the bodies? And so, as I'm reading these poems, some of them that I have read aloud for an audience before, I'm thinking about those ideas of ownership and what we make ours and what we are able to love because we make it ours, and what we aren't because we think it belongs to something grander. Anti-pastoral, this green and pleasant land. have no wonder left for petrichor, no heart to marvel at osmanthus sumac. My eye idles in the grass of your sprawling countryscapes, glazed with matte patina. In your pristine pastoral God lords over a league of moaning cattle. If men walk here, none notice the irony of his painting the cows, both black and white at once. But I am meant to swoon at the sight of water lilies, of quail pecking at blackberries the same way boar revel in the lush throat of a kill. Never mind the fireflies that have all but gone. Never mind who once blistered on this green and pleasant land. There's nothing you can tell me about beauty, about what glory languishes untended, blooming muteness despite all morass and blur. So if I must admire the magpies, their morbid halo, you will look first, unflinching, at what festers in the brush. The saltating maggots, the feasting butterflies, their dripping wings. A lot of the poems in this collection were inspired by historical events, archival things that I found photographs of, old books, and also contemporary events. So I'll read a few of those. And a lot of my work, I think, is inspired by real life because I'm a poet of relatively limited imagination when it comes to story. But I love taking a story that I've been provided, a kind of blank landscape, and bringing something to life. So this poem is called How to Run Away, and it was after a photograph, and here's the caption. It's June. The wheat has been cut, and enslaved farm boys are availing themselves of an old privilege granted them at harvest time of taking any rabbits they are lucky enough to capture in the stubble. You want the first stone, big and slow, with a heavy smack of a well pail on still water. This will scatter them, make long ears stretch and flatten like a back before a leather braid. A warning shot they think they can outrun. Guide your target with the light pebbles you toss to flush them out. Aim where their scampering will bend the grass next. A hand held over a stove learns fast where it's hot. The flame must learn too. Then go silent. A running animal is most vulnerable when it thinks it has then, at that moment, escaped. The flank deflates with relief as it will in your boiling water. Here's my sharpest stone. When thrown with any luck, it will be sticky from before. Move quick. Take no pride in chasing down what limps. Don't forget to pray. They say God chooses what grasses to let the scythe lower. That all we need is to be strong enough when the time comes to swing the blade. To the hair, you God. You say what gets cut when. I'm gonna read two more. Crown shyness. There are some trees, the black mangrove, the longleaf pine, that cannot bear the loneliness of touch, or perhaps of having been and no longer being touched. The difference between loving someone, that warmth, that shared light, and what memory of them remains too close to be passed. I was wrong not to ask if you wanted me. You never said more than you needed to, had to. But there was something like a canopy, though fractured, between us, that seemed to gently shade what had mushroomed down below. Enough for lichen to spread, soften. Whatever was there was delicate, an orb weaver's silk, an evening bat's purr. My only regret is that we're still too young for regret. But what could we have done then except be by ourselves together? I'm gonna read this last poem that Mary Jo helped me edit last year. Thank you, everyone. Still life with unidentified flora. 1. The flowers dying in the vase, those black-eyed Susans and lavender especially, refuse my pity, sorry in its own right. My stares filter through their dry wisps and catch on the tree in the yard. The one with the severed branch dangling, the dead limb, almost as long and full as a boy some would call a man. I am ashamed that I do not know from which kind of tree my mind has just hung that body. This memory that is not a memory of a boy who was never a boy, but a branch the tree will carry until it cannot. The tree would be right not to accept my shame as an apology. 2. Above the head-high arm of the jockey on the flower's face, a whip stretches, curving subtly in the shadow-dimmed porcelain. I spare the horse my sadness at the impending sting of leather on his brown flank. The flowers have taken that sorrow as their own. I am reminded again of what I am inventing. The picture is black and white, so too the horse and his rider. Where else have I found color where it never grew? 3. The flowers that, for what little I know, could be tick seed and Russian sage, stand firm when I offer one last apology, a pitcher of fresh water. And I consider this, how thin an offering of life when made under the wrong name, transparent as condensation on a pane through which I see another tree, its even smaller boy. I can no less forgive my mind than can a saw forgive its blade on behalf of what it has unmade. The drops of water on the glass face of the door run fast towards the ground. The limb is cut from the tree's body. The flowers at last shudder and bow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. Thank you to Left Bank Books. Thank you to Alana who introduced us. And thank you everyone for coming and anyone who's watching at home eating popcorn and drinking a beverage. Sounds good, doesn't it? Okay, I'm going to read poems from this book called A Film in Which I Played Everyone. And the title comes from, or was inspired by, a quote by David Bowie. He was asked by a fan, any film roles coming up? And he said, I'm looking for backing for an unauthorized autobiography that I'm writing. Hopefully this will sell in such great numbers that I'll be able to sue myself for an extraordinary amount of money and finance the film version in which I will play everybody. So when I read that, I mean, it's amusing, but what I also thought for some reason was what a perfectly succinct description of a lyric poem, because of course the poet plays everyone, and we We know, or we've been trained to think that the I, the speaker of the poem, is a construct. It's not really the poet, but I'd never been so clear that all the people in the poems are constructs and that the poet is playing them. So that gave me some permission to create characters, and I play them all. So you don't know who I am because I'm playing everyone. I don't know who I am. I'm going to read the title poem first, a film in which I play everyone. In scene 2, silence is asleep. I'm an arm in it. In an outdated Hollywood magazine, I found a photo of someone wearing my hair. How can that be? Now I can't stop thinking about the synaptic sparks over which no one has any control. Or they have some control, but not enough to count on in a crisis. I'm making sense all the time of all the senseless endings. A day is as long as the time it takes for the mind to consider life and death countless times, which must make a day plus a night a highway we're only vaguely aware of, since we're busy sitting in a chair or lying on a bed with a floral print bedspread, or walking to the store past someone with a dog on a leash and a phone in their hand, into which they seem to be saying, "That is not what I meant," blah, 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 to an absent ear. Home, you unpack the items you bought, crease the bags flat, stack them out of sight, all without saying a word. This is a non-speaking part. You're an extra. The day you were filmed, on the steps, walking into the school dance, the costume you wore was pure you. The set for the scene where everyone disappears was painted Parisian sky blue. The air burned like a curtain on fire. The fire kept going out, then being relit, a trick candle on a cake made of clouds. Sometimes I bring hand puppets to readings, and the reason is that I don't want people to be bored, and a hand puppet always, like, I don't know, lifts things up. And today I started looking for a puppet. It's not really a puppet, it's a stuffed animal. It's a blue burlap dog, and I couldn't find it. I was gonna bring it for this poem. The therapist. The therapist wears pretty dresses, and I sometimes so want to touch them. It makes my throat close to think of that fabric under my fingers. One day, a Wednesday, I asked, "May I?" She nodded, as if she too knew that that small act of intimacy would bond us together for life. And it has. She lives now inside a synapse where I'll never get rid of her. One more metal link in the collar that's unclasped each evening in dreamland, where I pretend I'm a well-behaved blue burlap dog walking along beside Anna Freud. Arf! 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 The oncoming cars slow on the curve as we pass. Are they looking at us? It's not possible to know. This is the way of the world, us and them, me and her, my cells evolving daily into a mashup of past and present, with and without. The instability is dizzying, ditto the revving autos and smell of petrol. I form-fit myself to the air the same way confession booth breath conforms to the shape of a closet. Similarly, my clouded face fades into the foam pillow when I lie down at night. This is her, I say. This is me. This is the want I didn't want when I had it, but now it is all that I have. A facsimile, a flowering pear trees, off-season leaves, the July scent of metal being beaten by a hammer and bouncing up and off the high-gloss surface of a silver-plated leaf. I read that poem in New York when, is it already last week, and my friend Timothy Donnelly read with me, and he reminded me that I had an imaginary dog when we were students at Columbia working on our MFAs, and we couldn't remember the name. And afterwards, I did remember it, and it was Roy. And Roy was a poodle, a toy poodle, with a puppy cut. Hanging the curtain. The curtain was meant to hide the zoo of my petty vices, but instead it was a coat that kept falling off my shoulders, watch that kept adding up the hours. After finishing my shift, I sat with a pill in my hand, then thought better of it and dropped it back into its plastic. In the family album, I stood at the edge, a dented girl with a divided mind. Daily, the same awareness. It was only a matter of time before someone would act with cruelty. Now, looking back, I see, will you, won't you join the dance? As the ever-pestering question. In the side yard, 6 rabbits in a cage, lettuce torn to bits, silent rats consorting with rusting tin cans at the bottom of the drainage ditch, occasional victims of a stepfather shotgun. Once a year, fireworks sounded the night out. A weeping shrub occupied the corner yard, the flowering branches bent like water falling from an active fountain. When I hit my limit, I crawled under it to escape the conceptual blur. I think I need water, and I have to go over there. Thank you so much, Ariana. What I'm covering over is the seething beginning, where I saw things but didn't know what they meant. The touching world kept putting its hands on me. There is no way to replicate what made no sense when it happened. What anything might mean after the fact is simply conjecture. That said, I am still alive inside it, and so see it acting like a glass tumbler code, where the usual method is one number turns while the others wait, then the next, the next, the next, not in the same row, but all eventually, and rarely, but sometimes, all turning at once. Sitting here now, the chasm below is the dizzying Grand Canyon all over again, and sadly, all over the world. The expansive now with its glowing circle moves into place like a globe. One can't actually know because it's always changing. Whole countries come and go. A secret retreats into its shell. I only know what I knew, and that was firsthand. It's little to nothing keeps me here and makes me think I would know what hell was if there was one outside of this one. Meanwhile, here comes a monster. So, sometimes in this book, I gave myself permission to construct stories, and I would take one thing from one story and one thing from another, and it allowed me to feel like I was a fiction writer, which is what I've really always wanted to be, and I failed at that, so I became a poet, and that's worked out okay. I'm not complaining, but I would have loved to have been a novelist. So this is a little novel vignette. I also want to say that reading in front of students, and there are several here besides Ariana, is always the most nervous-making because I just know they're sitting there and hearing me read these poems and saying, she told us not to do that. But I also hope that they remember that I always say the exception proves the rule. And so, yeah, this is called a starting point. I told myself 500 would be enough to begin to make a plan. In the end, it was over 2,000 when we divided the cash we kept in a tin. Waiting for him to leave, I moved seamlessly between assuming some mindless zen and reading a novel. He mimed playing the piano, a hyper-emotive Rachmaninoff, frenetic fingers pressing time and again against the blonde laminate of the kitchen table. He said I would never be as good as he was. He said it without saying it, making it clear he was a titan of the industry of succeeding at being. If anything, I was ancillary evidence of his genius. The bitterness of the sneering good luck when he left. I was stunned, humiliated, sick with the sense of precariousness, and yet embarrassed to be thinking of finances. Only now do I see inside my mind, unnerved by my own uncertainty. Thinking was hovering above the hot water I was in. I, a piece of cardboard, feeling my fiber lessening. The novel was a translation of Stendhal's The Red and the Black. Published in 1830, I read it as if it were a timeless allegory, the chronic inner problem of an inescapable provincial beginning, a social order that would not expand enough to let an outsider in. Fine, I said, but no, no. I'm just looking at the time, I'm not texting. I worked for a day in a garment factory in Philadelphia in the early 70s. A friend of mine, Sue Carroll, said that that was what we should do now that the Vietnam War had ended. And we should work in a factory and become involved with unions. And that sounded really just what I wanted to do. And so we went and got jobs in a garment factory, and I lasted one day, and she lasted her lifetime. She was much stronger than I was. On the factory floor, when I first heard fate saying how poor I would be, I'd wanted to ask, how far will that get me? I was sewing a seam that indicated time was worth nothing much. At the machine, my brain kept melting in at the edge. The clock was wrapped in cloth. When I paused, the machine became a crowd encased in ice, waiting to thaw. The factory buzzed at 4, followed by the jolt of an alarm at the perimeter. Green leopards entered, barely visible against the gray-green background. I called them my dollar bills. I kept my fingers crossed and nails cut to the quick. I was first assigned pieces. Then, when those became fewer and farther between, I practiced answers to inane questions. Yes, I left early. Yes, I tried my best. Yes, the weight of exhaustion sent me to bed. Yes, I'd been told I was a test case. Yes, I was an example of what not to do with what I don't know. Each day began with a slight oscillation while on switched into action, then the bimodal fevered bland. I held on to what little motion there was. It kept me from toppling over and into the through hole. Habit flattened the stairwell. A floor rose up to meet my face and feet, forming a level plane. The machine's incessant needle mimed in and out. For me, it was like fucking air. I don't know how people do it. I really, they brought me a bushel basket full of men's sleeves, of arms of dress shirts, white sleeves, and I had to learn how to make a curve around the top of it. And I never did, but I worked for 8 hours trying and watching that basket get lower and lower and feeling this sense of intense relief that it was going to finally be over and that they'd give me something different to do. But as soon as you just had like one layer left, they brought another bushel basket full. I knew I wouldn't last. And I became a poet. I'm also checking this again, okay. I could have been better if I hadn't been me, but I was stuck with my head tracking my thoughts, myself tracing each second back to a biblical beginning where A was A and Eve was some elusive bog-buried Lucy deep in the silt of a mythic mountain where Sisyphus opened his red leather diary and copied out the same daily assignment. Once in the middle of a disaster, a procedural policewoman knocked at my door to ask whether I was all right. Yes, I said I was, but only if we discount the present. Later, lying in the bed I was born in, I tallied my many errors, then added my everlasting love of the few I caught sight of in the midst of being me. It was as if I had gone to another country and now couldn't return without leaving part of myself behind. I wanted to say I love you, but each time I tried, the past tense pushed through. There at the edge of the water, Venus was where I last left her, standing on a half shell, staring hard at reeds bending in the wind. She and I both wanted to see something change. And this will be the last poem, and it's the last poem of the book. It's called Once Upon a Time, which is usually how things start, but it's the end. Once upon a time, that's all she said, then it's over. What did she know? She was a ghost-like, apparitional sensory effect chattering in my ear about matters relevant only to me, like a therapist in a chair going on and on about last week's conundrum, while you lie there, suspended in air, a levitation illusion, a pet shop sketch. For years I'd said yes, but stopped before finishing defining what yes meant. Today I said, yes, I will say no. She nodded her head in agreement. Instantly in front of me, a man, his hand raised. I admit I was afraid of the final cut across my mouth, my lips, flower petals folding in at the edge. Close your eyes, she said. I did. I saw the room I'd hidden in, the single window through which I used to look out at a moon that made the cold night appear as quaint as the pink feathery air after fireworks. I'm sorry, I have to start that over. After fireworks that drifted slowly over Tetris tile blankets laid out on a beach where the jigsaw interlock of sand grains mocked the ordinary imperfections inherent in any life. The deaths past and present in ashes, each discrete moment a memory palace waiting to be built alongside a suspended high-wire antenna set to receive the unending message, this is what is meant by your one and only life. Thank you. Ariana and I would be happy to take any questions, if there are questions. Where are my glasses? I can't see them. You all have your hands up, but I can't see them.
I can ask you a question.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me if I just use without the mic? Okay, great. There are certain images in your poems that I just think get at the minute atomic level of a thing, like the cardboard, its fibers slowly weakening, or the Tetris and the grains of sand folding together. Is there a way that you see an image, an object, and then you try to explore or zoom in on a kind of granular level, and then how do you work that into a poem that has so many other things going on?
One is sound, follow sound, so Tetris tile, and then you see the Tetris tiles, and then there's like, oh, I know, it's 4th of July, and people have their blankets out, and then you say to yourself, would it really look like that? And then it's like, it doesn't matter, it's serving a purpose. So you'll make a world, and then it will look like that. And then I think that since I'm on a beach, the sand is there. And then I'm thinking about things going together. And so, yeah, part of it is reading my mind, and that's partly training, to train yourself to to track what you're thinking instead of kind of jumping to the next thought, and sitting with that, and then the visual. And so I keep going visual thought, visual thought, visual thought, and trying to make those thoughts into a world that's visual.
I can see the alternation now that you say that, but I've never thought about it like that before. I appreciate that.
And I have a question for you. These poems are historic and yet very personal because it's part of your larger history. And are there poems in the book that are also smaller history? You inside a family, or you inside a city or a school or whatever?
Yeah, there are a few, particularly maybe the one that I wrote for my dad. Both sides of my family are from Norfolk, Virginia, which is southern Virginia, like almost on the border of North and South Carolina. And Norfolk has changed a lot in recent years. Gentrification is a major thing. So every time I come home, something has shifted, something is different. And my dad, when we would take my brother to get his haircut, would drive us around old South Norfolk to see what was still there. And the last time we did it, the church that my parents had gotten married in was gone. And that was kind of the last thing that had been there. And so there are these certain kind of moments in my life that I think map on well to the kind of tracking of history that I'm trying to do in Black Pastoral. But also, I'm a poet who is much more of a scientist than I am of an introspector. An inspector of the self. I'm much more curious about the outer world. I always have been. And so when I find those moments to map it on, it's nice, but my first impulse is to look at the world around me.
Anyone else, a question? Yes.
What about, it's not about poetry though.
Oh.
Weren't you at one time writing a murder mystery or something several years ago? Did that just never get done?
Who are you and how when did I talk about that?
20 years ago.
Yeah, okay. I was just telling one of my students today that I did write a novel. It's unpublishable, or so the publishing industry says. Nobody will accept it. It's about, well, it started because my mother and I had just moved back to St. Louis, so this would have been in 2000, so 24 years ago. My mother and I went to an antique store, and I was parking the car, parallel parking it, and my mother said, you know, I wonder why it's so interesting for me to go in these antique shops. And these are really not antique shops per se, they're, thrift stores and that kind of thing. And she said, I think it might be that when my sister ran away from home when she was 15, she took me with her. I was 5, and we'd been living with my father, and I woke up the next morning and I couldn't remember anything except this little metal plate that had a raised edge with an alphabet embossed around the edge of it. And he used to cut a wedge of bread in the morning and pour milk with a little coffee in it over that and feed it to me with a spoon. And there was something so poignant about that idea of a 5-year-old taken from, and the mother obviously was missing before that, and I burst into tears. And my mother, who was not the most empathetic person, said, well, you must have just needed a good cry. But be that as it may, I went home and I started thinking about what if somebody woke up and that's all they could remember. And then it was like, well, what kind of circumstances would have to happen for, what kind of trauma would have to precipitate that complete loss of memory in an adult? And I ended up just studying forms of amnesia, and I actually went over to WashU where I teach and got Roddy Rodiger, the head of psychology, whose area is memory, to help me, tutor me by giving me things to read, and then I would go and meet with him for an hour, and I nothing was fitting, and he just kept saying, "You'll figure it out, you'll figure it out," and I ended up writing this thing, and then at the end, I had a friend who was a psychiatrist, and I said, "So would you buy it if somebody, knowing what you know about psychiatry, would you buy the fact that someone could have their memory erased by trauma?" And he said, "Nope, they would just be trying to get a free meal in the hospital." It's like, oh God, that's cruel. And I thought, I got to come up with something to overcome his resistance. And so I said, what if, and I described a scenario that had happened to a child, and he was the father of a 3-year-old, and he said, that might work. And I thought, okay, that's what has to happen in the book. And so then I finished it, and I got an agent based on it, and he tried to get someone interested in it, but nobody was. And I haven't tried to do anything with it for 10 or 15 years, but thank you for reminding me of it. And it's so funny that I was just telling my student about it today, because she was thinking of writing a novel. So, any other questions?
Well, I have one, Mary
Yes.
Jo, and thank you all. That was a wonderful reading.
Thank you.
You talked about bringing the hand puppet, well, actually the blue dog, and then you couldn't find it, but I'm thirsty too. In some of your poems, I feel, maybe many of them, you have kind of assumed a puppet's voice and are playing with these details, arranging them obviously chronologically and image-wise, but there is this manufactured little dramatic scene that is unfolding, and you're humorous and playful frequently, even in situations that don't necessarily call for obvious humor. So, did you have experience with puppets in your?
Well, I played with dolls. I still have puppets at home, and I am taken with puppets, the idea of them, and I do feel that, well, I told in 7th grade, I was very frustrated with my math teacher and went down to the counselor's office and told him that I didn't need math because I was going to be an actress. And he said, he was very patient. He said, yes, many people want to do that. Very few do it. And I said, well, I will do it. So I shouldn't have to take this math class. But I do feel that poetry or any literature is a way of acting, and that you, whether you're acting as the caretaker, Ariana's of the field, of the people in the field. I'm a caretaker for these people who have smaller experiences. I think that that's what we do, is we record what it is to be a human being, and then we create a vehicle for that, because so many of our interactions with others are very superficial, even if they're warm. If somebody says, how are you? There's only a select few to whom you're going to tell how you really are. And the book is a way where someone is telling strangers, as if they are a close friend, these stories. And again, it can be fiction, it can be creative nonfiction, it can be a play, it can be poems, a song even. So it is our way of talking and sharing what it is to be human. And that's the value of it, I think, is otherwise you may not know that there are others who feel like you or, think like you. Thanks for that question.
Did you get out of the math class?
I'm sorry?
Did you get out of the math class?
No, I had to suffer terribly, and I've been marked by it. Any last question? Yes.
A question for Ariana. A lot of your poetry deals with the plant world, and I'm a plant enthusiast. And I notice there's like parts that like still are wonderful if you don't know plants, but like if you know what a hogweed is, like you read that differently. I'm wondering, how did you learn about plants?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I grew up in nature. The part of Chesapeake that I grew up in is still fairly forested. There would be in the mornings, like when we would wake up and I was little, there would be foxes and raccoons sitting on our doorstep, and we would have to like open and slam the door to get them to scurry back into the forest. So I was very much like somebody who grew up surrounded by nature, and also a lot of different landscapes in that area. There's the beach, there's the swamp, there's the kind of open plains of the field, there's the forest. And so a lot of it was that I was in nature, and a lot of it was that I was that kid who would sit in the library and read encyclopedias for fun. And so I think the intersections of that kind of environment and that specific curiosity led to my investment in plants.
Yeah, this is a question for Ariana too. Just thinking about the title of your collection and also from, I think, a blog on the book. I'm wondering how, to what extent your poetry engages religion, just an influence of religion on the Black experience on poetry, and how, to what extent you engage that in your poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad that's one I haven't really talked about yet, but absolutely pastoral, for the most part in the book, does mean the kind of field, the pasture, but I do think it also does mean that kind of have the religious undertones, and there are a lot of poems in here. There are a few that are particularly the Odysseys, which is this idea where I try to understand why God allows bad things to happen, which I think you could see the value of as a Black Southerner. And so I think a lot of my relationship to God and to religion through poetry is trying to figure out what God is doing. Why are we doing these things? Why are these things unfolding the way that they have? Maybe even trying to kind of predict or understand the mindset of a being that, for all that we know, probably doesn't have a mind. And so maybe in exploring the idiosyncrasies of nature and of how a storm can unfold and flatten a complete tract of land, or a field can emerge from nothing. I'm trying to grapple with the idea of God, the power that God has, and what that means, what I understand of it.
Hi, so we have a question from Pamela online, and this is for Mary Jo. And one of your poems that you were reading earlier, you said that there was something that you were doing that you tell your students not to do. She's asking if you could.
Oh, no, I assume that.
You assume?
Yeah, that my poems do things that I might have warned them away from, but it wasn't a specific thing.
Okay.
But, for instance, I often tell them that you don't need to keep track of time in poems. Then this happened, then this. And so things like that I might be guilty of in any given poem.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have to admit that often in the revision stage, I will look at it and try to find those things that I have, time and again told others not to do. And then, sometimes I'll be convinced that in fact it has to be done that way, as my students should be able to convince themselves, but they should ask themselves first, whether or not it is working and whether or not Mary Jo was right, it shouldn't be done. So.
Thank you.
Again for Ariana. I'm just thinking about what feels to me as the meditative nature of your poetry. And I just wonder if you get any influence from hymns, and I don't want to speculate on how your growing up was, but if it was religious, how probably the hymns you had in church influenced your poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hymns influenced the image nexus that I return to, right? I read about water a lot. Wade in the Water is my favorite hymn because of that kind of echoic and the line between the mourning and the ecstasy that to me is in that poem. So I will say a lot of the images come from those kind of things, but also I think the way I structure poems or the way that I might use refrain when I do or return to an image when I do is absolutely based on that kind of recurring refrain that happens in a hymn, especially at the end, right? That last line, that God's going to trouble the water. If I'm returning to a place of peace, if I'm returning to, the kind of tranquil landscape, then that's something that I'll return to maybe throughout the stanzas or the sections of the poem. So yeah, definitely the hymns have influenced it.
That's it.
Cool. Thank you so much.
We have copies for sale up at the front desk, and Ariana and Mary Jo will be signing copies. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
I'm gonna take this.
Meeting friends. Is there a residency in and yeah, it's fun. Except there's like this biblical flood in New York like last Friday. That's reading. Megan Fernandez.
I pre-ordered it. I never came.
Yeah, it's fine. What?
It's just like a vibrant so yeah, it was a recharge, but I also came back here and I felt like it was interesting. So now I'm just like kind of
I got it in the last.
well, nothing to complain. There was a lot of administrative things that we had to kind of like university circus.
I'm not very good, but I'm down.
When we knew they had it, it's still like
I'm not gonna break up text. I feel like
whatever happens, it's good to see you now. On one hand, it's fine. On the other hand, it's a little bit of a physically structured. How many more years? Well, like 2 years ago. I know. Yes. 3. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, poems. So, mostly reading these days. I wanted to do it, take a pause. Exhausted feelings.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, I'm not even sure if I'm exhausted.
And you never, that's the thing, you never.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm sorry. Why do I feel like,
Formally meet you.
Yeah.
Right.
I need you to get away from because I started freaking I already got the books. Nah, heard. Hot off the press. I wore like pre-signed have them cross off the signature and re-sign it.
Gotta end the stream and then